The day Naomi Ashcroft walked onto the Harper Ranch, she had $11, a cracked leather bag, and no idea she was stepping into a house still haunted by a dead woman's shadow. Elias Harper didn't want a housekeeper. He wanted someone to cook and disappear. His boys didn't want another person who would leave. And Naomi? She didn't want anything except to stop running. None of them got what they wanted. They got something harder, messier, and far more permanent. If you've ever built something real out of nothing, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the mountains like it had a grudge. Naomi Ashcroft felt it the moment the wagon crested the last ridge, and she got her first real look at the Harper spread. The ranch sat in a shallow valley carved out between two long ridge lines, and everything about it, the gray fence posts, the dark timber of the barn, the house with its narrow windows, looked like something that had decided a long time ago to simply endure rather than thrive. Snow had already packed into the low corners of the yard. The cottonwoods along the creek stood stripped and black against a sky that couldn't seem to decide between white and nothing. Harlan Briggs, who ran the general supply out of Cutler's Creek and had agreed to drop her on his way north, pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and didn't get down from the seat. "That's it," he said, nodding toward the house. Naomi climbed down herself. She didn't wait for help, and she didn't expect it. She pulled her bag from the wagon bed and slung the strap over her shoulder, and the weight of it, everything she owned fit inside it, settled against her hip like an old argument. "You know him?" she asked. "Harper?" Harlan took a moment. "Know of him. Good rancher. Lost his wife couple years back." He picked up the reins. "Quiet man." She nodded like that was useful information, though she suspected it wasn't. "Thank you for the ride," she said. He was already moving. She stood at the gate for a moment after the wagon had gone, listening to the wind work through the cottonwoods and the distant sound of cattle somewhere behind the barn. The cold was the kind that didn't announce itself. It simply settled into your bones and made itself comfortable. She tucked her chin down into her collar and walked toward the front door. She knocked twice. It took longer than she would have liked. The man who opened the door was taller than she'd pictured. Dark hair going gray at the temples, jaw rough with a few days of growth, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen considerable work. His eyes went to her face, then to her bag, then back to her face. He didn't smile. He also didn't frown. He had the look of a man who had made a careful arrangement with his own expressions. "Naomi Ashcroft," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell in town sent word." "I know who you are," he said. "Elias Harper." He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." The inside of the house was warm enough, which was something. A fire had been laid in the front room hearth, and there were signs of recent cleaning. The floors were swept, the table had been wiped down, but it had the particular quality of a space cleaned by someone who didn't really see it anymore. Things had been pushed rather than organized. Corners had been ignored. There was a coat rack near the door with 4 hooks. 2 held his things, the other 2 were empty, and one of them still had a woman's scarf looped around the peg. Faded blue wool. She noticed it and said nothing. Elias Harper gestured toward the kitchen table. "Sit down if you want." She did. He remained standing, which meant he wasn't sure about her yet. She understood that. She wasn't sure about much herself. "Mrs. Caldwell told you the arrangement," he said. It wasn't a question. "She told me the basics. Room and board plus $2 a week for the first month. If you want to continue, we agree on terms after that." "That's right." "She said you have 2 boys, Caleb and Sam, 14 and 8. He crossed his arms, not hostile exactly, but careful. "Caleb helps with the cattle in the mornings before school. Sam goes all day. I need meals on the table at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. The house—" He paused, looked around it briefly as if seeing it with some outside part of his mind. "The house needs attention. I haven't kept up with it the way I should." "I can see that," Naomi said. Something moved in his face. Not offense, more like a man who had been told something he already knew but hadn't expected someone to say plainly. "I'm not trying to be unkind," she said. "Just honest. I'd rather we both are." He studied her. "How old are you?" 30. "You've done this kind of work before?" "I worked for the Fenwick family in Billings for 4 years. Before that, I kept house for my father's household in Nebraska after my mother passed. I know how to cook, mend, preserve, manage a larder, and deal with boys. She held his gaze. I'm a capable person, Mr. Harper. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not fragile. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Where are you from originally? He asked. Chadron, Nebraska. My husband passed 2 years ago. She said it the way she had learned to say it, plainly, without giving the grief an invitation to sit down in the room with them. I went to Billings to work. The Fenwicks moved east. That brought me here. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss. And yours, she said. The second quiet that fell was different from the first, heavier. The boys don't need a mother, he said finally, his voice dropping into something flatter and more careful. They need someone who is steady and decent and will be here when I can't be. They've had... He stopped, started again. People have come and gone before. A girl from town lasted 3 weeks. A woman from Missoula before that didn't make the first month. He wasn't accusing her of anything, just laying out the landscape. My boys don't need more of that. Then I won't leave unless you send me, Naomi said. He looked at her. That's easy to say. Most things are, she agreed. I suppose you'll find out. He uncrossed his arms. It was a small thing, but she noticed. Room's at the top of the stairs on the left. It's not large. There's a window that sticks. You have to push from the upper corner. He moved toward the kitchen. I haven't eaten today. Boys will be in from the barn in an hour. If you want to start tonight, I won't object. Naomi set her bag down by the chair and stood up. What do you have in the larder? She asked. She found salt pork, dried beans, onions, a good-sized potato bin, and a sack of cornmeal that wasn't too old. She made a pot of beans with the salt pork and cornbread baked in the cast-iron skillet she found hanging from a hook near the fireplace. And by the time the door opened and let in a gust of cold air and 2 boys, the kitchen smelled like something other than absence. She heard them before she saw them, boots on the floor, the argument already in progress. I told you to latch it properly. I did latch it. Then why did it come open when I... Because you don't check. You just assume... They came around the kitchen doorway and stopped cold when they saw her. The older one, this would be Caleb, was nearly her height already, dark-haired and sharp-featured like his father. He looked at her the way you'd look at something unexpected in your path, not yet decided whether it was a problem. The younger boy, Sam, was rounder-faced and softer around the eyes, and he looked at her with an openness that was either trust or exhaustion or both. You must be Caleb and Sam, she said from the stove. I'm Naomi Ashcroft. Your father hired me to keep the house. Caleb said nothing. Sam said, What are you making? Beans and cornbread. Will that do? We had beans 2 nights ago, Caleb said. Caleb? His father's voice came from the doorway, warning. I'm just saying. What you're saying, Elias said, coming in and hanging his coat, is that someone made you a meal when you were cold and hungry, and you opened with a complaint. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked somewhere between 15 and 45 years old, depending on the moment. Yes, sir, he said, without warmth. Sam had already moved toward the table and was watching the cornbread in the skillet with the specific focus of a child who has learned to take comfort where it appears. Smells good, he said to Naomi. Good, she said. Sit down and let it cool a minute. She served the food without ceremony. Elias passed the salt without being asked. Caleb ate in silence, watching her from under his lashes when he thought she wasn't looking. Sam finished first and then sat examining the cornbread like he might have a second opinion about it. Did you put something in this? He asked. Bacon grease and a pinch of sugar, she said. Old Nebraska trick. It's different. Different good or different bad? He considered it with more seriousness than the question probably deserved. Different good, he said. Elias glanced at her across the table, barely, just a fraction of a look, and looked back at his bowl. Her room was small, as he'd said. The window stuck. The mattress was old, but the quilt folded at the foot of the bed was well made, and she could see from the stitching that a careful hand had made it a long time ago. She didn't let herself think about whose hand that was. She unpacked her bag in about 4 minutes. A change of dress, her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, which she kept not for devotion, but because her mother's handwriting was in the margins, and sometimes she needed to see that someone she'd loved had once had thoughts worth writing down. A small photograph of her husband Thomas, which she tucked into the back of the bottom drawer where she wouldn't see it unless she was looking for it. A good wool shawl, that was the sum of it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while and listened to the wind outside and the sounds of the house settling around her. She could hear the boys in the room next to hers, their voices too low to make out words, just the murmur of two people who had worked out their own private language over years of sleeping under the same roof. Eventually, that went quiet too. She thought about Thomas. She did that less often now, but she still did it. 2 years was long enough to stop being sharp, but not long enough to stop being true. She had loved him in the uncomplicated way that young people love when they don't know yet what they might lose. And when she lost him, fever, fast, too fast, she had not known what to do with herself. Billings had been an escape route more than a plan. This was another one. She knew that. She wasn't deceiving herself about it, but the house smelled like supper now, and the fire was still going downstairs, and somewhere outside in the cold Montana dark, there were cattle settling into their sleep, and Naomi Ashcroft thought that she had been in worse places than this. She would do her work. She would be steady. She would not let herself need anything beyond that. She almost believed it. The first week was an exercise in learning the shape of things. The Harper Ranch ran about 600 acres on the lower slopes, with another 200 of grazing lease further up the valley. Elias kept 60 head of cattle, a small herd of horses, chickens, and 2 dogs named Drift and Wallace, who regarded Naomi with the professional suspicion of animals who had seen women come and go before. She won them over with table scraps on the second day, which she felt only mildly guilty about. The house itself revealed itself gradually, the way old houses do. The pump in the kitchen worked but was temperamental in the cold, requiring a specific sequence of priming that Elias explained in 2 sentences without looking at her, clearly expecting her to have retained it completely, which she did. The wood stove in the kitchen burned hot and uneven on the left side. The root cellar door had warped and needed lifting and pushing simultaneously to open. The linen closet on the upstairs landing was organized with the particular logic of someone who had once been very organized and had slowly stopped caring. The towels were folded correctly but piled wrong, and there was a box of mending on the top shelf that hadn't been touched in what looked like at least a year. She found the mending box on her 3rd day and brought it down to the kitchen table and worked through it over the course of several evenings. Shirts with missing buttons, a boy's trousers with a torn knee, a quilt patch that had pulled away from its stitching. Each item told her something about the household without anyone having to say a word. On the 4th morning, Caleb came into the kitchen before 6 and found her already at the stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment, like he was deciding something. "Papa likes his coffee strong," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I already adjusted." He looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at her. He went and sat down at the table without further commentary, but she noticed he stopped positioning himself with his back to her. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was a grudging acknowledgement that she had not so far done anything wrong. Sam, meanwhile, had decided with the speed and conviction of an 8-year-old that she was a perfectly acceptable addition to his mornings. On the 5th day he came down early, before his father or brother, and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub, and drew while she made breakfast, and they didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. "What are you drawing?" she asked, after a while. He turned the paper so she could see. It was a horse, and it was better than she would have expected from an 8-year-old. Not a child's symbol of a horse, but something with real proportion to it, the weight and the legs correct, the head held at an angle that suggested movement. "That's good," she said. "Did someone teach you?" "No." He turned it back. "I just do it." "How long have you been drawing?" He shrugged. "Long time. Papa says I spend too much time with paper when there's work." She went back to the stove and didn't say anything to that. It wasn't her place, not in the first week. But she looked at the drawing again when he'd set it down, and she thought about it for the rest of the morning. Elias Harper was harder to read than his sons. He was a man who had organized his life around productivity in the way that people sometimes do when they have decided that productivity is safer than feeling. He was up before anyone. He was in the barn or the fields by the time breakfast was ready. He came in, ate, gave brief instructions, went back out. He came in at midday only occasionally. At supper he was present. He sat at the table. He spoke to his boys about the day's work. He answered questions. But there was a quality to his attention that was like a hand pressed to glass, nearby but not quite touching. She had learned at the Fenwicks to navigate around a man who didn't want to be known. You did your work. You were neither invisible nor intrusive. You let the house speak for itself. But there were moments. On the 8th evening, she had made beef stew with the last of the root vegetables and fresh bread from the afternoon, and Elias came in late from mending a section of fence that had gone down in the wind. He was cold all the way through. She could see it in the stiffness of his movements, and he sat down at the table and picked up his spoon and ate the first few bites in silence. Then he stopped. He looked at the bread. "My wife used to make bread like this," he said. His voice was neutral, completely flat, like he was reporting weather. Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "The recipe's my mother's. I learned it young." He nodded once. He picked up his spoon again. But something had moved through the room, brief as a draft from an unclosed window, and she had felt it, and she thought he had too. The first real test came in the second week, and it wasn't about housekeeping at all. She was in the barn on a Thursday morning. Elias had asked her to collect eggs and check on one of the hens that had seemed lethargic, when she found Sam sitting in the empty stall at the far end, knees to his chest, not crying, but close to it. The drawing paper was folded in his hand. She almost walked back out. It wasn't her business. That was the easy thing. Instead, she went and sat down in the straw a few feet from him, not close, not crowding him. "Rough morning?" she said. He didn't answer right away. "Caleb said drawing is for girls," he said finally. His voice was controlled in the careful way that boys sometimes get when they've decided that showing hurt is too dangerous. Naomi looked at the folded paper. "What do you think?" "I think Caleb's wrong, but it came out smaller than he meant it to." "He probably is," she said, "but that doesn't always make it stop hurting." Sam looked at her sideways. "Charles Russell draws," she said. "He's a cowboy painter, works out of Great Falls. Men in saloons buy his paintings for a lot of money." She had seen one of Russell's pieces once in a window in Billings. "Pretty sure he's not a girl." Sam thought about this. "Does he draw horses?" Sam asked. "Horses and cattle and cowboys. All of it." Another pause. Then Sam unfolded the paper carefully and looked at his drawing, and something in his shoulders came down a fraction. "It's still good," Naomi said. "The drawing. It was good this morning, and it's good now." She got up, collected the eggs, checked the hen, and went back to the house. She didn't make a story of it. She didn't tell Elias. She didn't expect anything from Sam in return. But at supper that evening, when Elias asked both boys how their day had gone, Sam said, "Fine." And Naomi caught him looking at her once, quickly, with something in his face that was not quite gratitude but was pointed in that direction. Caleb remained the harder problem. He was the oldest, and that meant he remembered the most. He would have been 12 when his mother died, old enough to understand everything, not old enough to know what to do with it. Naomi recognized the particular kind of guardedness in him because she had felt something like it herself after Thomas. The way you tightened your life down against any further entry. She did not try to breach it directly. That would have been a mistake. What she did was simply to treat him as competent. She asked him where the spare axe was kept, and she accepted his answer. She asked him which supply merchant in Cutler's Creek his father preferred, and she used the information. When he came in from mending fence one afternoon with a cut on his forearm that he was clearly planning to ignore, she set out the clean cloth and the medicine tin without comment, and let him decide what to do about it. He cleaned the cut himself. That was the first week. They were still nowhere close to anything resembling ease, but they were mapping each other's edges, and neither of them had yet decided the other was the enemy, and Naomi thought that was something. The end of the first month came without fanfare. On a Saturday afternoon, when the temperature had dropped enough that even the cattle were unhappy about it, Elias Harper came into the kitchen where Naomi was preserving the last of the apple stock and sat down at the table without being invited. She waited. "The month's done," he said. "I know. Things have been—" He put his hands on the table, looked at them. "You've done good work." "Thank you." "The arrangement," he said. "I'd like to continue it, if you're willing. I'll go to $250 a week." It was a fair offer, better than fair given what she'd seen other hired hands make. That's acceptable, she said. He nodded. He should have gotten up. Instead, he sat there another few seconds, his hand still flat on the table, and he said without looking at her directly, Sam told me about the barn, about what you said. She kept her eyes on the apple she was slicing. I didn't know he'd mentioned it. He did. A pause. I know I said they didn't need a mother. I still mean that. But what you did... He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he changed it. I appreciate it, he said finally. He's a talented boy, Naomi said simply. He should know it. Elias nodded once, got to his feet, and went back outside. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door had closed, and she noticed that her hands had stilled on the apple, and that the kitchen was very quiet, and that the cold outside was pressing against the window glass, and that on the inside it was warm. She picked up the apple and kept working. She was not going to let herself want anything beyond the work. She almost believed that, still, but just barely. The second month on the Harper Ranch was colder than the first, which Naomi had not thought possible until she felt it. The kind of cold that made the morning pump handle burn through her gloves and turned every breath into a small cloud that disappeared before it got anywhere. She learned to layer herself in the dark before the house was awake, learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't, learned that Elias was always up before her no matter what time she rose, and she had stopped trying to beat him to the kitchen because it felt like a competition she hadn't agreed to enter. What she did instead was have the coffee ready when he came in from the first barn check. That, at least, she could manage. He never said thank you for it, but he stopped being surprised by it, which she decided was the same thing, coming from him. The boys had settled into her presence the way you settle into a new pair of boots, with resistance at first. Then gradually, a grudging acknowledgement that the fit wasn't wrong. Sam had started leaving his drawings on the kitchen table some mornings, not showing them to her exactly, just leaving them where she might see. She always looked. She never made a production of it. If it was good, she said so, and she only said so when it was true, and he seemed to understand that, because he listened when she said it. Caleb was slower, but he was moving. The thing that shifted it was not anything Naomi planned. She was never good at planned gestures. They came out stiff and wrong, and people could tell. What happened with Caleb happened because of a Saturday in February that went badly for him in a way she hadn't seen coming. He had ridden into Cutler's Creek with Elias that morning to pick up supplies and see about a harness fitting, and he came back in the early afternoon alone. Elias had stayed to talk business with the feed merchant, and he came in through the front door instead of the back, which was unusual, and he went straight upstairs without taking off his coat or his boots. Naomi heard the weight of it in his footsteps. She gave it an hour. She made coffee and cut 2 pieces of the dried apple cake she'd baked that morning, and she carried them upstairs and knocked on his door. Nothing. I'm leaving cake outside your door, she said through the wood. You don't have to open it or talk to me, but the cake is there. She set the plate down and went back downstairs. 40 minutes later, she heard the plate get picked up. Another 20 minutes after that, Caleb came downstairs. He'd taken his coat off, at least. His eyes were red in that way that boys get when they've been crying and are furious at themselves for it. He sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the surface of it. Naomi poured him coffee. Real coffee, not the watered-down version she made for Sam, and sat across from him and waited. There's a boy in town, Caleb said finally. Derek Holt. His father owns the mill. All right, she said. He said... Caleb stopped. His jaw worked. He said Papa can't manage the ranch proper, that everyone in town knows it's gone to ruin since Mama died. He looked up then, and there was something raw and angry in his face that was too old for 14. He said it in front of everybody, in front of the whole street. Naomi didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him. What did you do? She asked. Nothing. He said it like the word tasted bad. I wanted to hit him. I almost did. But Papa's told me. He stopped again. So I just walked away and got on my horse and came home. That was the right thing, she said. It didn't feel like it. It never does. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. Does the ranch look like it's gone to ruin? He blinked. What? From where you're sitting. You live here. You work it every day. Does it look like ruin to you? He looked almost offended. No, we've got 60 head in there healthy. Papa fixed the lower fence line last fall. The hay stores are better than last year. Then Derek Holt doesn't know what he's talking about, she said. And 14-year-old boys who say things loudly in front of crowds usually don't. They're performing for someone, either themselves or whoever's watching. Caleb was quiet. Doesn't make it stop stinging, he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Knowing someone's wrong and not feeling it anymore are two completely different things, and they don't happen at the same time. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth, not exactly. More like he was recalibrating something. Did people say things like that to you? He asked. After your husband died? She hadn't expected the directness. It was his father's quality, she realized. That blunt honesty that didn't bother with approach. Yes, she said. Different things, but the same kind. People talking about what they don't understand and dressing it up as concern. He nodded slowly. Papa works himself near to death, so nobody can say that about us, Caleb said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a defense. Just an observation from a boy who had been watching his father very carefully for a very long time. I know, Naomi said. She didn't say anything else about it. She refilled his coffee and got up to start supper, and Caleb sat at the table for a while longer, and eventually he got up too and went to help her without being asked. Not a lot, just setting out the plates, carrying in wood for the box. And neither of them called attention to it. That evening, when Elias came in, something was different in the way Caleb looked at him. Not softer, exactly, but open in a way it hadn't been before. And Naomi thought that sometimes things shifted, not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't say, and the space you gave people to find their own way to the conclusion they needed. March brought a thaw, and then a hard freeze, and then 3 days of brutal wind that kept everyone closer to the buildings than they wanted to be. On the second day of that stretch, Elias was moving a section of fence posts near the east field when the ice gave way under him, and he went down wrong on his left arm. Not broken. He was insistent about that, firmly, and with an irritation that suggested the arm's integrity was a matter of personal pride, but badly wrenched, and the muscles in his forearm and shoulder had tightened up so badly by evening that he could barely lift the arm above his waist. He came in from the barn and Naomi saw it immediately. He was favoring it in that careful way that men do when they're trying not to favor something. Let me see it, she said. It's fine. Mr. Harper. It's fine, Naomi. She had never used his first name out loud before. She wasn't even sure why she used it then. It came out before she decided to say it, and once it was in the air between them, she couldn't take it back. He stopped. She met his eyes steadily and waited. It's my shoulder, he said, after a moment. Wrenched it. Went down on the ice. Sit down. He sat down, which told her it hurt more than he was saying. She had her mother's tin of liniment, camphor, and wintergreen, and a few other things her mother had learned from a woman in a small Nebraska town who knew more about bodies and aching than any doctor Naomi had ever met. She worked it into his shoulder and the upper muscles of his arm while he sat still and looked at the far wall and said absolutely nothing, which she understood was its own kind of trust. You'll need to stay off it tomorrow, she said. Can't. The fence can wait a day. It's not the fence. He moved his shoulder experimentally, grimaced. The Doran brothers are coming to look at 2 of the horses. I've been waiting on that for 3 weeks. Then let Caleb help you, she said. He's 14, and he knows those horses. Elias turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her, but near it. He's good with them, Naomi said. You know he is. He'd do well standing beside you for something like that. Something worked through Elias's expression. Not resistance, more like a man who had a habit of carrying things alone for so long that he had forgotten other options existed. I'll think about it, he said, which, she had learned, was his version of yes. The next day, Caleb stood beside his father when the Doran brothers came. She watched from the window while she worked, saw Elias talk, saw Caleb add a word here and there, saw one of the Doran men ask Caleb a direct question, and Caleb answer it straight. Saw Elias glance at his son with an expression that he thought no one was watching. That evening at supper, Elias said, Caleb handled himself well today. Caleb looked at his plate. Thank you, sir. I'm not saying it to be kind, Elias said. I'm saying it because it's true. Sam looked between them with the bright, uncomplicated attention of a child witnessing something good and understanding it without being able to name it. Naomi passed the bread and said nothing. The hardest thing about the Harper Ranch, she decided somewhere in the middle of March, was not the cold, or the work, or the boys, or even the complicated topography of Elias Harper's interior life. The hardest thing was the town. Cutler's Creek was small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was doing and had opinions about it. She heard things, not directed at her face, but the way you hear things in small towns, through the gap in a store aisle, in the pause before someone changes the subject. The hired woman at the Harper place, the widow they brought in, she seems to think she runs things out there. There's a word for women who situate themselves in a widower's house. She had heard versions of this in Billings, too. She was prepared for it in the abstract. What she hadn't been prepared for was how it would feel to hear it from Martha Poole, who ran the dry goods with her husband and who had always been pleasant to her face. She was in the back of the store reaching for a spool of thread when she heard Martha's voice from the front. Feel sorry for the boys, mostly. Man like Elias can't see what's right in front of him. A woman like that, nothing to her name, shows up from nowhere. You know what she's after. Naomi put the thread in her basket and walked to the counter and set the basket down and waited for Martha Poole to turn around and see her standing there. Martha turned around and saw her standing there. The silence was considerable. "I'll take this thread and a pound of sugar," Naomi said, "and the salt pork if you have any left." Martha Poole served her without a word. Naomi paid and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was not warm but was not hostile either. And she walked out to the wagon and put the supplies in the back and sat on the seat for a moment before she picked up the reins. She was not going to give anyone in this town the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. She was not going to carry this home to Elias or the boys and make it their problem. She was going to drive back to the ranch and make supper and get through the evening, and that was what she was going to do. She did exactly that. But she lay awake longer than usual that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the wind that had started up again, and she thought about what those women assumed she was after, and she thought with a cold, clear clarity that she did not know anymore what she was after. That was the honest answer. She had come here for work and steadiness and a place to land. She had not come here for anything more than that. The problem was that something more than that had started to exist, quietly, without asking her permission. She thought about Elias's shoulder under her hands and the way he had let her work on it without protest, and how that was more vulnerability than she suspected he allowed most people. She thought about Sam's drawings on the kitchen table and Caleb's reddened eyes and the plate she'd left outside his door. She thought about the way the house had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that habitable places change when someone decides to actually care for them. The linen closet was organized now. The mending box was empty. The window in the upstairs hallway had been refitted so it closed properly. Small things. Stupid things to care about. She cared about them anyway. Spring arrived in pieces. A warm week, then snow, then a week of mud so bad that the boots she set outside each night were heavy with it by morning. The cattle had come through the winter in good shape, which Elias announced at supper one evening with the quiet satisfaction of a man reporting a battle won. "Lost none," he said. "Not even the old brindle cow I wasn't sure about." "You should tell old Gunderson that," Caleb said. "He said last fall we'd lose at least 8. Gunderson's been predicting my failures since before you were born," Elias said. "He's still waiting." Sam looked up from his supper. "What's brindle mean?" "The pattern on a coat," Naomi said. "Streaked colors, brown and black usually." "Oh." He looked at his father. "Can I draw her?" Elias blinked. It was such a specific, unexpected request that it seemed to catch him off balance in a way that a great many things didn't. "The cow. She's interesting looking." Elias looked at Naomi for some reason she couldn't entirely explain, and she looked back, and he looked at his son. "After chores," he said. Sam nodded seriously and went back to eating. Later, while she was washing the supper dishes, Elias came to get the last of his coffee, and he stood near the stove for a moment, and he said, quietly enough that the boys couldn't hear from the next room, "You talked to him about the drawing." "Some," she said. "He used to do it more when he was small. I told him—" He stopped. "I didn't want him to think it was— I don't know. I said things about practical work." "He's 8, Naomi said. "He can do both." "I know that." He said it without defensiveness, just tiredly. "I know that now." She handed him his cup, and he took it, and she thought about what it costs a person to say, "I know that now," about something they said to their own child. "He's not holding it against you," she said. "Children usually don't when their parent pays attention." Elias nodded. He looked into his coffee. "Thank you," he said, "for what you've done with them, with both of them." It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her, and she felt it somewhere uncomfortable in her chest, and she said, "It's not hard to do right by good kids," which was true, and also a way of not having to receive the gratitude directly, because receiving it directly would have meant acknowledging something she wasn't ready to name. April came in mild, and the mud dried, and the evenings got long enough that there was light after supper. Naomi started taking a short walk along the fence line near the house when the dishes were done and the boys were settled. Just 15, 20 minutes. The sky out here was something different from Nebraska. Bigger, somehow. Or maybe it was just that the land was flatter in Nebraska, and the mountains here made the sky feel held in comparison, like it had a shape. She was on her way back from one of these walks in mid-April when she came around the corner of the barn and found Elias standing at the fence, watching the last of the light go out of the western ridge. He didn't hear her at first, and she saw his face in that unguarded way that you only see someone when they don't know they're being seen. Tired, but not the bone-deep, desperate tired of the first weeks. Something else. Not contentment exactly, but the absence of some particular tension. Like a rope no longer pulled to its limit. He heard her footsteps and turned, and the expression closed again, the way it did. "Evening," he said. "Evening." She came to stand near the fence, a decent distance from him, looking at the ridge. "Cattle settled?" "They're fine." They were quiet for a bit. The last light was purple and orange and then mostly purple, and the first stars were coming out. "You don't have to stay out," he said. "It's getting cold again." "I know. I like the evenings." She paused. "I like evenings out here especially. The sky's different." He looked at it. "I've never lived anywhere else," he said. "I don't know what different means from this." "Where I grew up, the sky was flat," she said. "Wide and flat. It's beautiful in its own way, but it's like looking at an open hand. This is like—" She searched for it. "Like the sky has walls, mountains holding it." He thought about this. Never heard it put that way. "It might not be right," she said. "No, it might be." He looked at the ridge. "My wife said it made her feel protected. The mountains." The word wife hung in the cool air between them, and Naomi waited. "She was from Illinois," he said. "Came out here when she was 22. Said it was the most frightening and beautiful thing she'd ever seen." "It is both of those things," Naomi said. He was quiet for another stretch. Then he said, "She would have liked you," in a voice that was careful and a little uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure he should have said it. Naomi didn't know what to do with that either. She turned it over in her mind and couldn't find the right response, and in the end she just let it sit there, true and unresolved, the way some things have to. "I should go in," she said finally. "Check on Sam." "He's fine," Elias said. "He fell asleep on the chair 20 minutes ago. I covered him." She looked at him. "I do notice things," he said quietly. There was something almost rueful in it. She almost smiled. She turned back toward the house before she could. Behind her, she heard him stay at the fence a while longer, and she didn't look back, and the cold settled around the ranch like something that had decided to be gentle tonight, for once, and the stars were everywhere by the time she reached the door. Spring settled into the valley properly sometime in the first week of May, the kind of settling that felt less like arrival and more like permission. The snow pulling back from the lower fields, the creek running fast and loud with melt, the cattle moving with something almost like pleasure in the longer grass. The Harper Ranch woke up with the season in a way that Naomi hadn't seen yet, having arrived in November's gray, and she found herself surprised by it. Surprised by the color of it. The ridge that had been charcoal and white for months turned green almost overnight, and the cottonwoods came back, and the whole valley looked like something that had been holding its breath. She was surprised, too, by how much she noticed it. She had not been a woman who paid much attention to scenery in her other life. Thomas had been the one who pointed things out. The particular angle of light on a field, the way the Nebraska sky looked before a storm. She had learned to see through his pointing. After he died, she had stopped looking mostly. There was too much in the middle distance that needed attention, and the far distance felt like something she had no right to anymore. But here she was, standing at the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in May, with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the ridge and thinking it was the most alive thing she had seen in 2 years. "You're going to miss breakfast standing there," Caleb said behind her. She turned around. He was already at the table, which was new. He had started coming down earlier, had stopped doing that careful positioning with his back to the room. It had happened so gradually she hadn't been able to mark the exact moment it changed. "I'm making it," she said. "You're early. Papa's already in the barn, wants to get the east pasture fence checked before it gets hot." He poured himself coffee with the ease of someone who had decided he had the right to it. He was nearly 15 now. He carried himself differently than he had in November. Not older exactly, but less braced. "He said to tell you he might not be in for lunch, so he says that and then he comes in anyway," she said, going back to the stove. Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. "Yeah," he said, "he does." Sam came downstairs in the particular way he had, 2 steps at a time, landing at the bottom with a thump that never failed to make the floor shake. He was carrying a drawing. She could see the rolled paper in his hand, and he had the expression he got when he'd been working on something since early morning. "Can I show you something?" he said to Naomi. "Eat first," she said. "But it'll still be good after eggs," she said, "and so will you." He sat down and ate with one eye on his drawing the whole time, and the moment she said he could, he unrolled it on the cleared end of the table. It was the brindle cow. He had worked on it for 3 weeks, she knew. She had seen him sketching and revising, had seen the pile of discarded attempts growing in the corner of his room. What he unrolled now was different from anything he'd shown her before. He had captured not just the shape of the animal, but something in the way it stood, the particular stubbornness of an old cow that has survived too many winters to be impressed by anything. Naomi looked at it for a long moment. "Sam," she said, "is it wrong somewhere? I kept thinking the back left leg wasn't—" "It's not wrong," she said. "It's good. It's really good." He looked at his drawing the way people look at things they've made when someone else confirms what they were privately hoping, like the thing becomes more real when someone else can see it. Caleb leaned over from his side of the table. He was quiet for a moment. "The head's right," he said finally, with the authority of someone who had spent his whole life around cattle. "That's exactly how she holds it." Sam looked at his older brother. Caleb looked back at his drawing. "It's good," Caleb said again, shorter this time, and went back to his coffee. Sam rolled the paper back up carefully and set it beside his plate, and finished eating with the contained satisfaction of a person who has had a very good morning. Elias came in for lunch. He always said he wouldn't, and he always did, and Naomi had stopped commenting on it because the commenting had never changed anything. What she had started doing was simply having something ready. Not a full meal, just bread and whatever was left from the morning, enough that he could eat standing up if he wanted, which he usually did, one hand on the counter and his hat still on, eating with the speed of a man who has taught himself to treat food as fuel rather than pleasure. She was slicing bread when he came in, and she said without turning around, "Sit down." "I'm not staying." "I know. Sit down anyway." There was a pause behind her that she had learned to read, that 3-second consideration he gave to anything that disrupted his habits. He sat down. She put bread and cold beef and a cup of coffee in front of him and went back to the counter and started on the afternoon's work. And they were quiet together in the kitchen with the windows open and the warm air coming through. And it was so ordinary that she almost didn't notice it was ordinary, the way you stop noticing a sound that's been there long enough. "East fence?" she asked. 2 sections needed resetting. Caleb got the post holes while I worked the wire. He ate. "Boy's getting strong." "He is," she said. "Worked without complaint all morning." He said it with something close to wonder, like he was still slightly surprised when his sons turned out to be capable. "Didn't even take a long break." "He's proud when you let him be useful," Naomi said. Elias was quiet. She could feel him thinking about that. "I should let him more," he said. "Yes." He looked up at that, maybe expecting her to soften it, but she wasn't going to soften something that was true. He held her eyes for a moment and then looked back at his food. "Sam showed you his drawing this morning," he said. "I heard him from the stairs." "He did. It's remarkable, Elias, genuinely." He looked at his coffee. "I said things about practical work," he said, "last fall, earlier." "I know. You mentioned. I was wrong. She turned around. He was not a man who said those words easily. She had come to understand that over 5 months of watching him, and he said them now with a directness that cost him something, and she thought that was one of the things she had come to trust about him, that when he said something it was because he had decided it was true, and he was going to stand behind it. He knows you see him, she said. That's what matters. Elias nodded. He finished his lunch and stood up and put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. Thank you, he said, for the bread. It's what's here, she said. I know, he said. That's not why I'm saying it. He went back out, and Naomi stood at the counter for a while, and she thought that she was doing a very poor job of not wanting anything. The evening that changed everything was not a dramatic evening. That was the thing about it that she would remember later, how plain it was, how completely ordinary the whole hour was right up until it wasn't. It was the middle of May. The supper had been nothing special. Roast chicken, potatoes, the last of the spring onions from the garden she'd been coaxing along the south wall of the house. The boys had been talking all through the meal, which was itself something. A year ago, she gathered, suppers in this house had been exercises in silence. Now they argued about the merits of different fence post woods with the passion of people who have strong opinions and an audience. And Elias let them argue and added the occasional word and didn't try to shut it down the way he might have before. And Naomi moved between the table and the stove, and the whole room felt alive in the simple, unremarkable way that living rooms feel alive when the people in them are comfortable with each other. Sam had eaten about 3/4 of his supper when he went somewhere else in his head, the way he did, some internal project taking over. And he sat with his fork in his hand and stared at the middle distance with his eyes soft and unfocused. Sam, Elias said. Sam came back. Sir? Finish. Sam looked at his plate, ate 2 bites, looked up at Naomi. Naomi, he said. Are you going to be our new mother? The table went absolutely quiet. It was the specific quiet of a room where everyone has heard something and nobody knows yet what it means. Caleb stopped in the middle of reaching for the bread. Elias's fork stopped moving. The fire in the hearth made its small sounds, and outside a horse shifted in the barn and the creek ran, and none of that filled the silence in any way that mattered. Naomi looked at Sam. He was watching her with the open, guileless directness of an 8-year-old who genuinely wanted to know and had not yet learned that some questions break things open. Where did that come from? She asked him, her voice even. He shrugged. Mrs. Halverson at school said her mother said you're like a mother to us already. He looked at his plate. I don't know what that means. If it's different from what you are now. Sam, Caleb said, his voice tight. I'm just asking. It's a personal question. It's about our family, Sam said, with the particular immovability of someone who does not yet understand why the question is dangerous. Naomi looked at her own plate. She breathed. She had a specific physical sensation of something in the room having shifted weight, the way a table feels when too many things get set on one side of it. She looked up and made herself look at Elias, because not looking at him would have been worse than looking. He was looking at her, not away, not at his food, not at Sam, at her, with an expression she had not seen on him before, or had seen in pieces, in moments, but never this assembled and this unguarded. It was the face of a man who had been asked a question he had been asking himself for longer than the moment suggested, and who had run out of room to avoid the answer. I work here, Naomi said to Sam. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. I keep the house, I cook your meals and mend your things, and I'm here when you need someone. But you care about us, Sam said. Not pushback, just fact. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Yes, she said. I care about you. Then what's the difference? Caleb stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back. I'm going to check on Drift, he said, too quickly, his voice rougher than usual. He picked up his plate and took it to the side counter and went out through the back, and the door closed behind him, and the room was quieter still. Sam looked at where his brother had been and then at his father, and something in his expression shifted. 8 years old, but not stupid, not even a little. He could feel the weight of what he'd dropped in the middle of the table, even if he didn't fully understand its shape. I didn't mean to say something wrong, he said. You didn't, Elias said. His voice was quiet, controlled but not cold. Finish your supper, Sam. Sam ate. He ate quietly and without looking up, and when he was done, Elias told him to go wash up, and he did, and his footsteps went up the stairs and the upstairs floor creaked above them, and then there was only the fire. Naomi started clearing the table. She needed her hands to be doing something. She stacked the plates and carried them to the basin and poured water from the kettle and started washing, and her back was to Elias, and she could hear him not getting up, and the silence between them had a texture now that it hadn't had before, dense and full of things that had been accumulating for 5 months without anyone naming them. She heard his chair move. He came and stood near the counter, not behind her, off to the side. She could see him at the edge of her vision without turning. "Naomi," he said. "I know what you're going to say," she said, not unkindly. "I don't think you do." She stopped washing. She kept her hands in the water because it was something to hold on to. "He's 8 years old," she said. "He asks what he wants to know. It doesn't mean anything has to—" "Stop," I said quietly. She stopped. "I've been telling myself things," he said, "since a long time, that you work here, that this is an arrangement, that what's happened is practical. The house runs better. The boys are steadier." He paused. "Those things are true, but they're not the whole truth, and I've known that for a while, and I've been not looking at it." She turned around. He was standing a few feet from her with his arms at his sides and his face open in a way she had seen only in pieces before, at the fence in April, at the lunch table, in the barn when he thought no one was watching. He looked exhausted and honest, and a little like a man standing on ground he had decided to stop running from. "I don't know how to do this," he said. Since Claire, I haven't—" He stopped on the name, and she saw what it cost him to say it. Claire. The blue scarf on the hook by the door, the bread his wife used to make. "I buried it all so far down I wasn't sure it was still there." "Is it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's the problem." She dried her hands on her apron because she didn't know what else to do with them. "I'm not her," Naomi said. Not a warning. Just something that needed to be said. "I know that." He said it without hesitation. "I know exactly who you are. That's not what this is about." "What is it about?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working out how to put something into words that had been living in him without words for months. "When I come in from the fields," he said slowly, "I don't dread the house anymore. There was a long time when I did. When I'd stand at the barn door and find reasons to stay out there another hour because the house was it was just where the absence was." He looked at the floor for a second and then back at her. "I don't do that anymore. I come in, and you're here, or the boys are here, or there's something on the stove, and it's a house again. Not just a place where things used to be." She felt it in her throat. She was not going to cry. She refused to cry. She was 30 years old, and she had been through enough to be past crying at kitchen conversations, but her throat was doing something inconvenient, and she pressed her lips together against it. "That's the boys," she said. "That's you letting them back in. Naomi." His voice was patient but firm. "Don't do that." She looked at him. Don't make yourself smaller than you are," he said. "You've been doing it since you got here. You say things are fine when they cost you. You say you're just the housekeeper. You let people in this town say things about you, and you don't correct them." He paused. "I should have corrected them. I know that. I didn't because I told myself it wasn't my place. And the truth is, I didn't want to name what your place was, because naming it meant deciding something." She stood very still. "Have you decided something?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said, not with Sam's question still in the middle of the room, and Caleb out in the barn processing whatever he's processing. He rubbed the back of his neck, and it was such a human, uncertain gesture that something in her chest ached for him. "But I'm not going to pretend anymore that this is only what the contract said it was." She nodded slowly. Her hands were folded in front of her, which was not a thing she usually did. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. "That's all I can say right now. I told you that in November, and it's still true." Something moved through his face. Relief, she thought, or the edge of it. "That's enough," he said. "For tonight, that's enough." He didn't move toward her. She didn't move toward him. They stood in the kitchen with the fire going low and the water in the basin going cold, and the distance between them the particular distance of two people who have said something real and are giving it room to exist before they decide what it means. "I'll check on Caleb," Elias said. "Tell him—" She stopped. What? She thought about the plate outside his door in February, the way his shoulders had come down after. "Tell him supper was good," she said. "Tell him it was because he brought in good wood this morning. Something specific. He needs specific." Elias looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant she had said something he would turn over later. "All right," he said. He went out. Naomi stood in the kitchen and finished the dishes in the dark, settling quiet of the house, and she heard the back door open and close below, and she heard, faintly, through the old walls, the sound of Elias's voice in the yard, and after a moment Caleb's voice answering, shorter and then a little longer. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. She set the last plate to dry and leaned her hands on the counter and looked out the window at the dark yard, at the barn where the light was burning, at the ridge beyond it holding up the sky the way she'd tried to describe to Elias in April. Walls, she'd said, like the sky has walls. Maybe that was what she'd been building, without meaning to, without naming it. Maybe that was what the whole winter had been. She didn't know what came next. She was not going to invent a story about it. She knew better than to do that, had learned that the hard way, had learned that what you build in your head to protect yourself from uncertainty usually bears no resemblance to the thing that actually arrives. What she knew was this: the house was warm. The boys were upstairs and downstairs respectively, and they were all right. The man who employed her was in the yard telling his son something specific about wood, on her advice, and tomorrow morning the coffee would be on the stove before anyone else was up, and the east pasture fence would hold or it wouldn't, and the ridge would be there in the early light. She thought that was enough to go on. She was not sure she believed it entirely, but she thought it, and sometimes that was where everything started. The next morning was the kind that pretended nothing had happened. That was the thing about frontier mornings. They didn't care what you'd said the night before, or what you'd felt, or what you'd left hanging unresolved in a warm kitchen. The sun came up, the cattle needed feeding, the pump needed priming. Caleb came down the stairs at 5:30, with his boots already laced and his face arranged in the particular neutral expression of a 15-year-old who had decided overnight to carry himself with dignity, and Sam came down at 6 with a drawing already in progress and asked if there were biscuits, and Elias came in from the barn with mud on his boots and a piece of fence wire still coiled around his forearm that he'd forgotten to put down. It was, in other words, an ordinary morning. Naomi made biscuits. She made them because Sam had asked, and because her hands needed something to do, and because biscuits were biscuits. They didn't require her to think about anything except the ratios, and the ratios were a comfort. Elias poured his own coffee and sat down and did not look at her in any particular way, and she did not look at him in any particular way, and between them was the specific, careful quality of two people honoring an agreement they had not yet made explicit. Last night was real. Last night would keep. But the morning was the morning, and there was work, and the work came first, that they both understood without discussing it. What was different was small. He said good morning when he came in. He had not always done that. She said good morning back. She had always done that. Sam didn't ask his question again. She wasn't sure whether he'd forgotten it or whether some child instinct had told him the question had landed somewhere important and was still doing its work. Either way, he was focused on his drawing and his biscuits, and Caleb was focused on his coffee, and Elias was reading something he'd brought in from the post, a letter from his brother in Oregon, she gathered from the way he frowned at it. And the morning moved the way mornings did. What changed over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was so quiet and incremental that Naomi could only see it in retrospect, the way you can only see a tide going out once enough shore has appeared. Elias started coming in for supper before 6 instead of at 6 or after. Not every night, but most nights. He started sitting longer at the table after eating, his coffee cup in his hands, talking to the boys or asking about the day. Not interrogating, just asking. And sometimes the conversation would move past the boys and land between the two adults. and neither of them would redirect it. They talked about the ranch, about the cattle prices she'd heard mentioned in town, about whether the South Garden Wall was going to hold through another season, about a book she had that he admitted he'd read years ago and disagreed with on several points, and she disagreed with his disagreement, and the argument lasted 3 evenings, and neither of them resolved it. And that was fine. Caleb watched all of this with the sideways attention of someone taking inventory. He didn't say anything about it. He was processing, she understood, had been since the supper with Sam's question, and he would come to whatever he was going to come to in his own time. She didn't push. She had learned that pushing Caleb produced exactly nothing, and waiting produced eventually almost everything. The push she hadn't expected came from an entirely different direction. It was a Thursday afternoon in late May, and she had driven the wagon into Cutler's Creek for the week's supplies. She had gone alone. Elias was occupied with a buyer who had come to look at 2 of the horses, Caleb was helping, and Sam was in school. And she moved through the merchants list with the efficiency she'd developed over months, the kind of efficiency that comes from knowing exactly what a household needs and not being sentimental about getting it. She was in the dry goods when Margaret Fowler appeared beside her. Margaret Fowler was 50, the wife of the minister, and she was one of those women who collected information the way others collected china, carefully, with an eye for value and display. She had been pleasant to Naomi's face, and Naomi had never fully trusted it. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Margaret said, in the warm voice of someone approaching a subject sideways. "How are things out at the Harper place?" "Fine, thank you. The boys well?" "Very well." Margaret picked up a spool of ribbon and set it down again. "You know, people in town have been, well, people talk. You know how it is. Some of the women were saying they thought it was a shame, a woman of your age spending her best years as hired help with no prospects of her own." She paused delicately. "Have you thought about your own future? There are families in Billings who take on good housekeepers. A widow, respectable, capable as you clearly are, you could do well for yourself somewhere less isolated." Naomi set her flower back on the shelf with a degree of care that she was aware constituted restraint. She turned and faced Margaret Fowler directly. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I didn't come to Cutler's Creek by accident, and I'm not staying by accident. My future is my own business, and I'm satisfied with how I'm attending to it." Margaret blinked. "Of course, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Naomi said. Not unkindly, clearly. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Fowler." She finished her list and paid and loaded the wagon and drove back to the ranch with the particular quiet fury of a woman who has been told by someone comfortable that she should want less. The fury faded somewhere on the long road back, replaced by something more complicated. The recognition that Margaret Fowler had said out loud what Naomi had been saying to herself for months, that she should be careful, that she should keep this practical and bounded, that she should want only what she'd come here for. She pulled the wagon up to the house and sat on the seat for a moment in the late afternoon light. The front door was open. Through it, she could hear Sam's voice. He'd gotten back from school, telling someone about something that had happened at recess, his words coming in a fast, enthusiastic rush. She heard Elias's voice say something short, and then Sam laugh, and the laugh carried out into the yard. She sat there with the reins in her hands, and she thought, "This is the thing I was not supposed to want." Then she got down and started bringing in the supplies, because the supplies needed bringing in regardless of what she wanted, and that was the kind of woman she was. Elias found her in the garden that evening, the south garden, the one she'd been working since early April, coaxing tomatoes and beans and the stubborn squash plants that kept threatening to quit, was her quiet place in the evenings when the light lasted. She was staking a tomato plant that had gotten ahead of itself when she heard his footsteps on the path, and knew them without looking. He stopped at the garden edge. She kept working. "Boys are inside," he said. "I know. Sam drew something at school today. His teacher kept it to show the other students." She looked up at that. "She did?" "Sent a note home with him." He said it with a thing in his voice that she had learned to recognize, the expression of a man who is proud and slightly undone by it simultaneously. He was very serious about the whole thing, like it was a business matter. "It is," she said. "To him." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote back to his teacher. thanked her. She pulled a weed from the base of the tomato plant. That was the right thing. I didn't used to write back to his teachers, Elias said. I kept meaning to, and then things. You're doing it now. He came and crouched down on the other side of the plant, which surprised her. He wasn't a man who often put himself at ground level when there was standing to be done. He picked up a small stake she hadn't gotten to yet and pushed it into the soil without being asked, and held it while she tied the twine. I heard something today, he said, about what happened in town. Her hand stilled. Who told you? Harlan Briggs was at the feed store when I went for the wire. He mentioned it. He said Margaret Fowler was talking about it in the dry goods. Elias's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not. He said you handled it well. I handled it, she said. Well is a matter of opinion. She had no right to say those things. She thinks she does. Naomi tied off the twine and sat back on her heels and looked at him across the plant. People like Margaret Fowler always think they have the right. She's not wrong that I'm a hired woman with no prospects by the conventional definition. She's just wrong about it being a problem. It bothers you, he said. Of course it bothers me. She said it plainly. I'm a person. It bothers me when people talk about me like I'm a piece that doesn't fit the pattern. It has always bothered me, and I've never been able to make it stop bothering me, and I've made my peace with that. He was looking at her with that assembled expression again, the one she'd seen in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. She had thought about that expression, had thought about it more than she'd wanted to. I should have said something months ago, he said, in town, when I heard things the first time. You didn't know what to say. No. He pressed the stake a little more firmly into the soil, even though it was already secure. I knew what I would have had to commit to by saying it, and I wasn't. He stopped, started again. I wasn't ready. Are you ready now? She asked. It came out more directly than she'd intended. She saw him take it. He looked at the tomato plant between them, and then at her, and he said, I bought a chair last fall. She blinked. What? In September, before you came. I was in Cutler's Creek, and I was at the furniture dealer, and there was a chair that was... It was a good chair, good wood, well made. And I bought it. He paused. I didn't know why. I told myself we needed another chair for the table. We didn't need another chair. We had enough chairs. She looked at him. I put it at the end of the table, he said. It's been there all winter. You sit in it. She had sat in that chair every day for 6 months, without once wondering where it had come from. I bought it in September, he said again quietly. You didn't arrive until November. The garden was very still around them. The light was going amber and long across the valley. Elias, she said carefully, I'm not telling you that I'm not trying to make it into something it wasn't. I bought a chair because I needed one, or I thought I did, and I don't know what it means that I bought it then. He sat down on the ground entirely now, knees up, and looked like a man who had decided to stop being careful about his clothes for the duration of this conversation. What I know is that when you came, you sat in it, and the table felt right for the first time in 2 years. And I noticed that, and I put it away. And I kept putting it away. And last week Sam asked his question, and I ran out of places to put it. Them. She said nothing. She was not capable of saying anything immediately. I'm not good at this, he said. I should tell you that directly in case you haven't gathered it. I'm not a man who says things well. Claire used to say I communicated like a fence post, upright and mostly silent. The corner of his mouth moved, something that was almost a smile and wasn't quite. She wasn't wrong. You're saying things now, Naomi said. I'm trying. He looked at her. I know what I'm asking it's not a simple thing. You'd be taking on 2 boys who have already lost a mother, and a man who spent 2 years making himself into someone who didn't need anything, and a ranch that is functional but not always easy. He said it all straight, without softening it. I'm not offering you something simple. I know what you're offering, she said. What am I offering? She looked at him across the tomato plant, this quiet, complicated, stubbornly honest man sitting on the ground in his work clothes in her garden, and she thought about November, the wagon pulling away, the gray house, the empty hooks on the coat rack. She thought about the linen closet and the mending box and the barn on a cold morning with a boy who needed someone to tell him his drawings were worth keeping. She thought about bread recipes and coffee, measured strong in a shoulder. She'd worked liniment into by firelight and a fence at dusk and a sky held by mountains. She thought about the chair. "You're offering me the thing that was already here," she said. He held her eyes for a long moment. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a performance, just the words, quiet and direct and a little rough around the edges, the way he said everything. She took a breath. "Ask me again when we're not both sitting in the dirt," she said. Something broke open in his face then. It was the closest thing to undone she had ever seen him. Not grief, not worry, but something that had been held under a long time surfacing all at once. He laughed. It was short and it was real, and she had never heard him laugh like that before. And it was, she decided, one of the best sounds she had ever heard in her life. "All right," he said. "Inside, then." They both stood up, brushing soil from their clothes, and they went inside. The kitchen table had 4 chairs. Sam was at the far end working on something in his sketchbook. Caleb was sitting with a glass of water and a book he wasn't quite reading. He had the look of someone who had positioned himself to seem occupied while actually paying attention to everything. Elias stood near the counter and looked at Naomi, and she looked at him, and some agreement passed between them about the next few minutes. "Boys," Elias said. Both of them looked up. Elias pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, which was unusual. He rarely sat except at meals. "I need to talk to you about something." Caleb set his book down entirely. Sam closed his sketchbook. He seemed to understand from tone alone that this was a close attention moment. "I've asked Naomi to marry me," Elias said. No preamble, no softening. "She hasn't given me her answer yet, but before she does, I wanted to talk to both of you." Caleb was very still. Sam looked at Naomi, and then at his father, and then at Naomi again. "What did you say?" he asked her. "I said I'd answer him inside," she said. "So here we are." "Why do you need us?" Caleb asked. His voice was careful, not hostile, and she had learned the difference, but careful, in the way he got when something mattered too much to approach carelessly. "Because you live here," Elias said. "Because this is your home, because what happens in this house matters to all of us. And I'm not going to make a decision that changes all our lives without at least telling you what I'm thinking." Caleb looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at Naomi, and she met his eyes and didn't look away, because looking away would have been cowardice, and she owed him better than that. "Is it because of Sam's question?" Caleb asked. "Sam's question made me say out loud what I'd been thinking for a while," Elias said. "That's different from causing it." Caleb sat with that. "She's not Mama," he said finally. "I know that," Elias said. "She knows that too." "I don't want her to be," Caleb said. It came out quick, like something he'd worked out and needed to say before he lost the nerve. I'm not looking for that. He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't want someone else to leave." The room was quiet. Naomi sat down. She sat down in her chair, the chair from September, the chair Elias had bought before she existed in his life. And she folded her hands on the table and she looked at Caleb directly. "I told your father in November that I wouldn't leave unless he sent me," she said. "That's still true. It will still be true." She paused. "I can't promise you that nothing hard will ever happen. I can't promise you the world won't do what the world does. But I can promise you that I'm not going anywhere on purpose. I'm not that kind of person, and you know me well enough by now to know it." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally, quietly. "I know that." Sam, who had been sitting with his hands pressed flat on his closed sketchbook, said, "So what's your answer?" Naomi looked at Elias. Elias looked at her. "Yes," she said. Sam made a sound of satisfaction, the kind of sound that meant he had suspected this outcome all along and was pleased to be confirmed in his suspicion. He picked up his sketchbook and opened it again. Caleb stood up from the table. He picked up his book. He went toward the stairs and stopped with his hand on the newel post and turned around. "Naomi," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be working out the words, his face going through several drafts. "When I was in that barn in February," he said, "with the cake outside the door." He stopped. Thank you for that." She nodded. "You're welcome." He went upstairs. His footsteps were steady on the treads, not heavy, not rushed, just his own pace. Elias sat at the head of the table, and Sam sat at the end, sketching something with the focused serenity of a boy who has received exactly the information he needed, and Naomi sat in the chair that had been waiting since September, and the fire was going, and the evening was full, and the house held all of it without complaint. After a while, Elias reached across the corner of the table and set his hand, briefly, on hers. Not a gesture from a story. Just a hand, rough from years of work and cold, set on top of her hand, and then withdrawn. It was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough, which was the thing about quiet things. They accumulated, and what they added up to was heavier and more solid than anything loud could have built. She got up to put the kettle on. Sam didn't look up from his drawing. "Is it going to be different now?" he asked. "The house?" Naomi set the kettle on the stove. "Some things," she said, "not the important ones." Sam considered this. "Okay," he said, and went back to his work. Outside, the Montana dark had settled full across the valley, and the stars were the way they got out here, unreasonable in their number, spread wall to wall across the held sky. And the ranch sat quiet beneath them, the cattle easy, the barn dark, the cottonwoods still along the creek. Inside, the kettle began to heat. They were married on a Saturday in early June, 3 weeks after the evening in the garden. It was not a large wedding, neither of them wanted large. Elias had asked her once, carefully, if she wanted something more, a church ceremony, the full town assembled, the kind of occasion that announced itself. And she had said no without having to think about it. She had done the announced version the first time, with Thomas, the white dress, and the flowers, and the neighbors watching. That had been right for who she was at 22. She was 30 now, and she knew the difference between a ceremony and a marriage. And what she wanted was the marriage. What they had instead was the ranch yard on a clear June morning, with the mountains green to the tree line and the creek running and the cottonwoods making their early summer sound. That dry, papery rustling that she had come to love without realizing it. Judge Albright drove out from Cutler's Creek, a small, square man with a serious face, who had married and buried half the county and seemed to understand that both of those things deserved equal gravity. The Harlan Briggs family came, and the Dorans, and a handful of others from the valley who had known Elias long enough to have hoped, privately, for something like this. Naomi wore her good dress, the dark green one she'd bought in Billings 2 years ago and worn only twice. She had let the hem out and taken it in at the waist and added a collar of cream-colored lace that she'd found in the bottom of the dry goods bin in town, the last of a bolt, almost like it had been waiting. She had no particular feelings about the lace. She did not assign it meaning it didn't have. But she put it on and looked at herself in the small mirror in her room still, for 2 more days until they rearranged the house. And she thought that she looked like herself, which was all she had ever wanted to look like. Caleb had brushed his good jacket without being told. Sam had drawn something the night before and wouldn't show anyone what it was, which meant it was a gift of some kind, saved for later. Elias was standing in the yard when she came out. He had shaved carefully, and his hair was combed, and he was wearing the jacket she had mended in the winter, the one with the torn lapel she'd stitched so close to the original seam that you couldn't see the repair unless you knew to look. He watched her come across the yard, and he had the expression of a man who had decided to let himself feel something without managing it, which was, she had learned, the bravest thing Elias Harper ever did. "You look good," he said. "You too," she said. They stood next to each other in front of Judge Albright and said the words that needed to be said, and Elias's voice was steady throughout, and hers was mostly steady with one moment near the end where it wasn't quite, and she accepted that. The judge was brief and meant it, and when it was done, the small gathered crowd made the sounds that people make, and Harlan Briggs shook Elias's hand, and his wife embraced Naomi with a warmth that surprised her, and she found she could receive it. Sam appeared at her elbow immediately after and held out a folded piece of paper. "I made this," he said. "For you. Both of you." She unfolded it. He had drawn the house. Not a child symbol of a house, but the Harper Ranch house in real proportion. The front porch with its 2 posts, the window where she stood mornings to watch the ridge, the cottonwood in the yard that leaned slightly east. And at the table visible through the front window, 4 figures. A man and a woman and 2 boys, seated together, the table between them full. She couldn't speak for a moment. "It's the family," Sam said, in case she hadn't understood. I know what it is, she said. It's remarkable. I worked on it for 2 weeks. It shows. Elias was looking at it over her shoulder, and she could feel the stillness in him that meant he was moved and was not going to say so directly. He set his hand briefly on the back of Sam's neck, and Sam ducked his head slightly with the contained pleasure of a boy receiving acknowledgement from his father. Caleb was standing a little apart, talking to one of the Doran boys, but he glanced over and caught Naomi's eye and gave her a nod, small, direct, and looked away again. That was Caleb. That was enough. She folded the drawing and put it in her pocket and kept it there all day. The days that followed were not a story about transformation. Nothing rearranged itself into a new and better version. The pump was still temperamental. The east fence needed work again. Caleb had a bad week in June where he was surly and closed off for reasons that turned out to be entirely unrelated to the wedding. There was a girl in town he had looked at twice, and she had not looked back, and 15 is 15, and that kind of hurt doesn't yield to logic. Sam went through a phase of being so absorbed in his drawing that he forgot his chores twice in a row, and Elias was short with him about it in a way that left both of them stiff for 2 days before Naomi sat them both down at the kitchen table and told them with some directness that they were behaving like people who had forgotten how to talk to each other. He's not wrong that the chores matter, she told Sam. I know, Sam said, staring at the table. And you're not wrong that you need to draw, she said. Both things are true. So you make a schedule and you keep it. That's the only answer I have for you. She looked at Elias. And you, she said. He raised his eyebrows. When you're short with him because you're tired and not because he actually did something wrong, she said, that's not fair, and you know it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Sam. She's right, he said. I was tired that day. That's not your fault. Sam looked up. Okay, he said. A pause. I'll do the chores before drawing. Every day? Elias said. Every day, Sam agreed. It was not a beautiful moment. Nobody cried, nobody embraced, nobody felt that the family had leveled up into something new. They just solved a small problem at a kitchen table, the way small problems have to be solved, and went back to their evening. That was what Naomi had come to understand about family, real family, the kind made of daily decisions rather than feeling, that it was mostly this: small negotiations, acknowledged wrongs, adjustments, the willingness to come back to the table rather than dig into your corner and wait. She and Elias had their own version of this to learn. He had habits she had not had to accommodate before she was his wife. The way he carried his worry silently until it had compounded into something larger than it needed to be. The way he said he would handle something and then did not ask for help even when help would have made it easier. She had her own. She went quiet when she was hurt, the way she had always gone quiet, and she was not good at saying what was wrong. When what was wrong was something that felt too small to say out loud. There were evenings in the first summer that were awkward in a way their evenings hadn't been before. The specific awkwardness of two private people learning to occupy the same space in a new and binding way. One evening in July, she was quiet at supper in the specific way that Elias had started to recognize, and after the boys went up, he sat across from her at the table and said, "What is it?" Nothing serious. But something. She looked at the grain of the table. Margaret Fowler was in town today. She was civil, but the way she was civil. She stopped. I know it doesn't matter. It bothers you anyway, he said. It bothers me anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I spoke to Reverend Fowler last week. I told him that his wife had made comments about you that were unkind and untrue, and that I expected better from people in this community. He said it without any particular drama, just the fact. He apologized. Whether he conveyed that to her, I don't know. She stared at him. You didn't tell me, she said. I didn't know if it would make things better or worse, and I didn't want to give you more to worry about. He paused. That was probably wrong. It was a little wrong, she said. I'll do better. Tell me things, she said. Even the things you think might make it more complicated. I'd rather have the complicated truth than the simple version you've cleaned up for me. He held her eyes. Same goes, he said. When something's wrong, I'll try. Try harder than you're comfortable with, he said. I can take it. She almost smiled. "You're very sure of that." "I'm sure of more than I used to be," he said. It wasn't the most romantic exchange she could have imagined, but she carried it to bed that night, and she felt the weight of it, solid and real and more reliable than romance. And she thought that this was what she had wanted without knowing she wanted it. Not a man who was easy, a man who was honest, a man who would say, "I'll do better," and mean it, and actually try. Margaret Fowler did become civil eventually. Genuinely civil, not the performed version. It took most of the summer, and it came in the form of a peach preserve left on the porch without a note, which Naomi recognized as the language of women who cannot bring themselves to apologize directly, but want you to know they mean to. She made no mention of it. She sent back an empty jar and 2 of her mother's biscuits, and that was the end of it. And they were cordial from then on in the way of people who have agreed without discussing it to move forward. The town itself settled its opinion over time, the way towns do. People watched and formed their views, and what they saw: a family that worked together, a ranch that didn't go under, 2 boys who went to school and did their work and turned out to be decent, gave them less to speculate about. Naomi understood that she would never be entirely free of the particular scrutiny that attached itself to women who did not fit the expected pattern, who arrived without connections and made a place for themselves through their own effort. She had made her peace with that in the way you make peace with weather, not by liking it, but by refusing to let it determine what you did. What she had not expected was how much the community would become, over time, simply the backdrop to her actual life rather than a threat to it. The Doran family became friendly in the straightforward way of ranch families. Shared labor, shared tools, meals at each other's tables, in the brutal times, and the easy ones alike. The schoolteacher who had kept Sam's drawing wrote her a letter in September, saying that Sam's work had been shown at the county fair in Billings, and had won a second-place ribbon in the youth category, and would Naomi tell his parents. Naomi read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again, and then went to find Elias in the barn. She handed it to him without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. "Second place," he said. "In the county," she said, "at the fair in Billings." He folded the letter and was quiet for a moment in that way he had when something had come in under his armor and he was deciding how to respond to it. "He's going to need proper materials," he said finally. "Good paper, real drawing tools, not pencil stubs." "I know where to order them," she said. "From the art supplier in Missoula. I've looked into it." He looked at her. "Of course you have." "He was always going to be good at this," she said. "He just needed someone to not tell him he wasn't." Elias was quiet for another moment. "I told him to focus on practical work," he said. This was not a new admission. He had said it before, but he said it again now like he was finishing the accounting of it. "I was wrong about that." "You were wrong, and then you changed," she said. "That's the part that counts." He handed the letter back. "Tell him tonight, at supper." He paused. "You tell him. He should hear it first from you." She looked at him. "It started with you," Elias said simply. "Telling him his drawing was good. That morning with the biscuits, it started there." She didn't argue with it. It was true, and she was not going to be falsely modest about something true. She put the letter in her pocket next to the place where Sam's wedding drawing had lived for one long June afternoon, and she went back to the house. That evening at supper, she slid the letter across the table to Sam without comment. He read it with the same seriousness he brought to everything that mattered to him, his face going through the stages. Confusion, then understanding, then something that was too big for his face to contain comfortably. He looked up. "Second place," he said. "County-wide," Naomi said. He looked at his father. "You should write to that art supplier in Missoula," Elias said. "Your stepmother has the address." Sam looked at her. She nodded. "Can we go to the fair next year?" Sam asked. "When I enter again?" "If you enter, and if you're chosen," Elias said. "Then yes." Sam nodded seriously. He picked up his fork. He put it down again. "I'm going to enter," he said. "Not bravado, just fact." "I know," Elias said. Caleb had been reading the letter over Sam's shoulder, and he passed it back without comment. But later that night, when Naomi was banking the fire and the house was quieting down, she heard Caleb's voice from the top of the stairs. "Sam, he said. That drawing of the brindle cow. You still have it? Yeah, Sam said. Can I have it? For my room. A pause. You can have it if you frame it proper. I'm not framing a drawing. Then you can't have it. A longer pause. Fine, Caleb said. I'll get a frame. She heard Sam's door close and then Caleb's, and the house went quiet, and she finished banking the fire and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment the way she had stood in it on her first night. November, the cold pressing at the window glass, a strange house full of grief and silence. It was none of those things now, or it was all of them still, in the way that places keep their histories. Claire's blue scarf was still on the hook by the door because Elias had not moved it and she had not asked him to. The grief was real and it had a right to its place. But there was more in the house than grief now, layered over it and under it and through it, the way a good season changes a field without erasing the soil beneath. She thought about what she had come here for in November, room and board and honest work. She thought about what she had said to herself on that first night, that she would do her work and be steady, and she would not let herself need anything beyond that. She had failed at that last part completely. She was glad. There is a thing that people do not tell you about loss. Any loss. A husband, a home, a version of yourself you thought was permanent, which is that it does not leave. It does not resolve into acceptance and disappear. It lives in you, and you live around it. And slowly, if you are lucky and stubborn and willing to walk into a strange house in November with a cracked leather bag and $11, you build enough life around it that it becomes one true thing among many true things rather than the only true thing there is. Naomi had not come to the Harper Ranch to find a family. She had come because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because the work was honest and the people were real. She had built something here not through grand decisions but through small ones. A plate outside a door, a drawing taken seriously, a shoulder worked with liniment and firelight, an argument about a book carried over 3 evenings, a chair that had been waiting before she existed. That was the thing she had learned, here in this valley, with its mountains and its cold and its complicated, inarticulate man and his 2 sons who had needed someone to stay. That the most important things do not arrive as revelations. They accumulate. They arrive in the space between ordinary moments, in the texture of days lived close to other people, in the decision, made again and again and again, to remain. She went upstairs. Elias was still awake, reading by the lamp the way he did, and he looked up when she came in, and there was nothing remarkable about that moment, nothing that would have stood out to anyone watching. A man and a woman in a room at the end of an ordinary day. Sam's going to enter the fair again next year, she said. I know, Elias said. He'll probably win first. He might, she said. She sat on the edge of the bed and Elias set his book down and the lamp threw its soft radius across the room, and outside the Montana dark was full and deep, and the stars were doing what they always did out here, which was everything. Naomi, he said. I'm glad you knocked on the door, he said, that first day. She thought about the gray house, the wind, Harlan Briggs driving away without getting down. So am I, she said. She meant it the way you mean things that have cost you something and turned out to be worth it anyway. Not simply, not without the full weight of everything that had come before. She meant it with Thomas in it, and the $11, and the Fenwicks, and the Billings winter, and the particular quiet fury of driving back from town and sitting on the wagon seat and deciding to stop making herself smaller than she was. She meant it with all of it. Outside, the cottonwoods made their sound. The house held.